do this. It's my first opportunity to share some of this research about Sudan in this kind of webinar context. I've shared thoughts about Sudan in lots of contexts, but this is a first for this one. So I'm really excited for this, and so grateful to see so many people who have joined us in this way. My name is Jesse Zink. I'm a priest ordained in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, but right now I live in Cambridge, England, where I'm working on a PhD, and my PhD research is about the role of the Church in South Sudan during Sudan's civil war, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, which is what we'll be talking about some more in this session. And I also serve as assistant chaplain right now at my college, Emmanuel College in Cambridge. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm grateful for these answers that are appearing on my screen, some of these answers about what evangelism and mission are, and hopefully we'll begin to think about some more of that. One of my firm convictions is that there's a lot of things out there that we in the North Atlantic world, thinking broadly of the Church of England, the U.S. Church, can learn from our sisters and brothers in Christ around the world. So I'm eager to share some of that and perhaps give you some food for thought that you can take home and think how that sort of coheres with what you already understand mission and evangelism to be. So before we begin, why don't we begin with prayer? I'll lead us in this prayer, which is on the screen right here, prayer from our prayer book. So let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you stretched out your arms of love on the hard wood of the cross, that everyone might come within the reach of your saving embrace. So clothe us in your Spirit, that we, reaching forth our hands in love, may bring those who do not know you to the knowledge and love of you, for the honor of your name. Amen. That's a prayer that I really like, and it's often one that I say as part of morning prayer. I find that it has so much to say about evangelism and mission just in there, about Jesus stretching out his arms of love on the hardwood of the cross, about how mission is connected to Christ's suffering, but it also provides us a vision of a transformed community created by Christ's death and resurrection. That's the everyone might come part. And I think some of those dynamics are really at the heart of what God is calling us to be as people of God in the world. So let me just give a quick overview here of some of the things that I want to cover in this time. So the focus here is going to be on the Dinka people, who are also known as the Jeng people, who live in southern Sudan. And my particular time focus is Sudan's second civil war, which happened basically from about 1983 to 2005. So I want to sort of do four things, and I'm going to stop halfway through for any questions, and then we'll have some time for conversation at the end. First thing I want to do is provide a little general background on South Sudan and the Dinka, and then I want to relate some of the history of evangelism and church growth in southern Sudan during the Civil War, and then we'll turn to some particular stories of the church during the war to see what we can learn from the experience of Dinka Christians. And perhaps along the way we can answer a couple of questions. One would be, what is the goal of evangelism? And another question would be, how do we evangelize? So that's sort of the roadmap for where we're going. To begin, let's see here, we'll bring up, that's the roadmap, we'll bring up an actual map of Sudan. In 2011, many of you will know, South Sudan, which is the part that's south of that dotted red line, became an independent country of South Sudan, and that's the area of focus right now. And the Dinka people, if you can see on that map, and I hope you can all see that map, are sort of concentrated in a band that goes from Bor, which is sort of right there on the Nile River, up towards Awio, which is gradually towards the northwest. You'll be able to see in this next map, the Dinka are that sort of, I don't quite know what color that is, sort of looks like a rather gray-green. so the Dinka people live in that stretch of territory. And South Sudan is known for its ethnic diversity. You can see that purple blotch is the Nuer, who are a very closely related group of people to the Dinka. And then you have other groups, the Bari-speaking people, and then the Zandi, who are that gray in the southwest there. So South Sudan contains a whole lot of diversity. That means the church has had a whole lot of diversity as well, with lots of diverse experiences. So again, my focus in this particular presentation, although we can get into some more broad conversation during the question and answer later, will be on the Dinka, and particularly the part on the east and west banks of the Nile River. So that's the area, if you can see on that map, I know it's a little bit small, the area sort of around Bor and around Rumbek. Just in case anybody is watching this later or now with great experience of the Dinka, that's going to be my particular focus. Oh, that's great. You can see that. Thanks very much, Miguel. That's wonderful. Great. So those are our maps. That sort of orients us to where we are. So we'll move right along. And to talk about the Dinka, who are an agro-pastoralist people, which means that their life revolves primarily around huge herds of cattle. Cattle in Dinka culture were used to cement marriage relationships. They were used for their milk and manure, and they were the center of the Dinka traditional religion. The sacrifice of cattle was the central religious act for the Dinka. Dinka religion believed in a single high god who is known as Nialich, but the focus of their religious activity was a series of lesser divinities who were known as Jak. This picture here is a picture of a yik, which we might call a shrine, to a jok, and then in the plural is Jak. So these are these lesser divinities which are at the center of the religion. When someone was sick, for instance, that indicated that the relationship between the person and the jok was not right. An animal had to be sacrificed to put the relationship right. The Jak offered protection to the Dinka, and in return, the Dinka offered them their belief. Anthropologists who interacted with the Dinka often labeled them ethnocentric. By that, they meant that the Dinka were people who were generally quite content with the way of life they had chosen. Indeed, Dinka people found this way of life superior to all other ways of life. So when British colonial officials arrived in the early 20th century, the Dinka were largely uninterested in what they had to offer and mostly dismissed them. So that was sometimes hard to do in the face of some pretty brutal pacification campaigns from the British. This disinterest in what the British had to offer extended to Christianity. There were two major mission efforts among the Dinka, one from Anglican missionaries of the Church Missionary Society, and another from Catholic missionaries of the Verona Fathers Mission. And neither of these missionary groups had much success. And in fact, when missionaries were expelled from the country in 1964, only a small minority of Dinka were Christian. These were people who had been educated at mission schools and now lived in small urban centers in southern Sudan. There was virtually no church presence in the cattle camps and the rural villages that were at the heart of Dinka life. Just to contrast the experience of the church in this period, here's a picture of Dinka youth in a village in the 1940s. So you can see sort of what Dinka young men were up to in that period. And then here's a picture from the early 1950s of Daniel Dengatong, who was the first Dinka Anglican bishop, consecrated in 1955. That's his wife, whose name I'm pretty sure is Elizabeth, but I didn't have time to double check that before this presentation, on his right, or on the right. So you can just see the contrast between these two pictures, just in terms of clothing, and I could also say that this picture of Daniel Dengatong is taken, I believe, in Bor, which is a town. So Christians were these sort of people who dressed in a certain way. They had been to school. They were educated. Daniel Dengatong could speak, read, and write in English. And then you had Dinka in the cattle camps who were in a different position. So that was sort of the state of the church in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1970s, there was some modest change in the church and a little bit of church growth for a variety of reasons. but for the most part, it was rarely the case that someone was both Dinka and Christian. Now, that's a little bit of background on society and the church. Politically speaking, the years since Sudan's independence in 1956 have been traumatic for the country. There's lots of complex dynamics that are underlying violence in Sudan, but the basic dynamic is one that pits rulers in Khartoum, the capital in the north, against other parts of the country that feel excluded or marginalized from power. So during the colonial period, the British spent a lot of time and energy on education and development in the north, but very little energy in the south. So at independence in 1956, Southerners felt excluded from power. This led to one civil war that lasted sort of from independence to about 1972 that pit the South against the North. And then this violence and destruction mostly affected the Equatoria region of the country, which is in the far south of the country, close to the border with Uganda. Then there was a period of relative peace in the 1970s, and then there was a second civil war, the one that we'll focus on, that began in 1983, and a peace agreement ended that in 2005. This second civil war was especially catastrophic. It's estimated that perhaps as many as 2 million people were killed, hundreds of thousands displaced, famine, disease, destruction on a huge scale. And the Dinka were right at the center of this. The rebel movement in the second war was known as the Sudan People's Liberation Army, and the leaders of the SPLA, as it is called, were largely Dinka. So this meant that the Northern Army directed its reprisals on Dinka territory. Then, compounding the devastation, in 1991, the SPLA split along ethnic lines between Nuer people and Dinka people. That led in the early 1990s to some devastating inter-ethnic violence that further added to the misery of war. So in various ways, all across Dinka territory, there was major devastation. And yet, I want to caution us when we think about the history of the church in southern Sudan, and especially about the history of the Dinka, that we not simply focus on war. Even in the midst of civil war, people still have to live their lives. So many people get displaced by war, but many are not. And the war affects everyone, but there are other things going on in society as well. And it is true that, the war is this major shaping event for Dinka people, but I just want us to be clear that there's always more stuff going on in society. And one of the most remarkable things that was going on in Dinka society during the war involves the church. At the beginning of the war, leadership of the Dinka church, and I'm here speaking particularly of the Dinka Anglican Church, which is called the Episcopal Church of the Sudan, consisted of a small group of clergy and lay people. This was the leadership. And they were in these towns in southern Sudan, places like Bor and Rumbek, which I sort of briefly pointed out on the map before. The Northern Army, however, gradually took control of these towns, which made it unsafe for Dinka people to remain there. So they fled, church members just as much as anyone else, to the rural villages and cattle camps. And as they went as evangelists. They told the people that they met, their friends and their relatives, about the good news of Jesus Christ that they had learned while living in a town, a place like Bor. So this was the basic evangelical encounter. There were lay Dinka Christians, lay people, meeting non-Christian Dinka and talking about God made known in Jesus Christ. Whatever else we think about evangelism, I think it's about this. Talking about Jesus. And the astonishing thing was that the response so many Dinka people showed. These people were eager and interested to learn more about Jesus. Lay people would begin new congregations. Often these would begin as a gathering of people under a tree. Here's the picture we're looking for. Here's a picture I took of a church on a recent trip last year, but you can see that this is where congregations begin. In fact, they often begin likely without the benches. They would beat a drum, call people together, sing songs, reflect on the themes contained in the songs, offer prayers for healing, and move on. There were few prayer books or Bibles, so this was what liturgy looked like. And it worked. Many people began to seek baptism, and the church began to grow. A major factor in all of this evangelism was the role of women. Many of the most successful evangelists in the 1980s and 90s, when all of this was happening, were women. People who'd had some exposure to Christianity and then returned to their homes determined to tell others about what they had learned. Here's a picture of a woman, Mary R.Y. Majak, who I spoke with her last September outside of Rumbek in Sudan. Mary is a woman who was living in the town of Rumbek, had to flee when the war began. She went back to her home area, and over the course of about 8 or 10 years was responsible for starting 23 new congregations in the area around where she used to live. So women were at the forefront of this religious change. Now, the complete story of religious change is beyond the scope of this presentation, but to just skip ahead to the mid-1990s, by that period it was clear that the Dinka had experienced massive religious change. Before the war, the church was a small minority institution. By the end of the war, among some Dinka, the church commanded virtually universal allegiance. Now, in some parts of southern Sudan, to be Dinka is to be Christian. So that's some background, some very brief background on some of what I want to talk about, this major experience of religious change that took place in this period. So for the rest of our time together, I want to expand on 3 particular aspects of Dinka church growth and to think about what they tell us about evangelism more generally. We'll just go through one, and then we'll sort of pause and have an opportunity for any initial questions you might have. So to think about this first section here, I want to ask a question. You don't have to answer it, but just think about it yourself. And that is this: what is the goal of evangelism? I said earlier that evangelism is basically showing people Jesus. That describes what evangelism is, but I want us to think about what is the goal of evangelism. One way, I think, of thinking about the goal of evangelism is to say that the goal of evangelism is to increase belief, to get people to believe in God as made known in Jesus Christ, and have them believe that the love of God is active in their lives. Based on the outlines of the story I've just given you, you might say that the Dinka came to believe in God. The evangelism was successful. But what happened to that previous religion that I mentioned, the one that they so firmly held on to? In particular, what happened to the Jack, these minor deities that were at the center of their religion? Well, Christian evangelists during the war made it clear that in order to be a Christian, you could not sacrifice to Jack anymore. In fact, not only could Dinka not sacrifice to Jack, they had to destroy the shrines to the Jack. This became an important part of conversion. In fact, it became almost a quasi-liturgical moment. A group of converts would go with, a group of Christians rather, would go with a new convert to his or her home, where they would destroy the sacred objects, whether that was a particular palm tree or whether it was a shrine of the kind that I showed a picture of earlier. Often this meant burning the shrine, a public event that would attract notice and attention. And it seems straightforward enough. If you believed in God as made known in Jesus Christ, you couldn't believe in Jack. But things are a little more complex than that. When Dinka converts destroyed their Jack, they did not stop believing in the existence of Jack. Instead, destroying the shrine was believed to invite retribution. And the protection that you needed from this retribution was baptism. You had to get baptized after destroying your shrines, or else the jock would come and punish you for abandoning it. This view was widespread not only among Christians but among non-Christians. There were many instances of a time when one person or one household would destroy their shrine and become Christian. That also prompted the convert's neighbors to seek baptism as well. Excuse me. The reasoning of the neighbors was that they were worried that if the neighbor who was converting and destroying the shrine was baptized, that neighbor would be protected, and therefore the jock would come and punish anyone in the general area. So therefore, everybody in the area had to be baptized for protection. In at least one instance, one new convert was so eager for protection that he asked that not only he be baptized, but also that his cows be baptized as well, because he wanted to make sure that they were protected as well. Not surprisingly, one of the major debates in the church during the war was about baptismal practice. And I can tell you, to the best of my knowledge, no cows were ever baptized. But an ongoing challenge for the church was education of new converts in Christian rites and sacraments. But the reason I'm talking about all of this is I want us to think about what we mean when we talk about belief. In English, the word belief can be used in at least two different ways. The first is when we say something like, I believe in Santa Claus, or I believe in unicorns. When you say that, you're saying that you believe in the existence of something. But belief can also be used in another way, as in, I believe in you, or I believe in my friend. When we use the word belief in this way, we're saying something more like trust or confidence, like I trust you, I believe in you, I have confidence in you. And I think it's this second way to think about belief as trust that more accurately captures the nature of Christian belief. When we say in the creeds on Sunday, we believe in one God, I don't think that we're primarily saying we believe God exists, though I certainly believe God exists, and that is one thing that we are saying. But I think the force of those statements in the Nicene Creed is to say, this is the God in whom we place our trust. During the war, the Dinka never stopped believing in the existence of the Jack. But they did stop trusting the Jack. For a variety of reasons, the war showed the Dinka that the Jack were no longer offering their protection. Indeed, some Dinka interpreted the war as an indication that the Jack had turned on the Dinka and become evil and were now deliberately undermining their safety and security. For Dinka to become Christian during the war meant that they were now placing their trust in God, made known in Jesus Christ. And you'll just see here, this is a picture from a youth group in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And you can see it's a dramatization of the Christian rejection of the jock. So the jock is there in the middle. I mean, it's a stylization representation. And then you have the youth group using these crosses that look a lot like spears, pushing the jock away. And this, I think, demonstrates that it's not the case that they no longer believed in the existence of the jock, but they did no longer trust the jock. And I think that this is a helpful idea for us as we think about evangelism in our own context. So thinking of my current ministry with college students, one major challenge I encounter is the question of belief. I often talk with students about Christianity, and people will say, oh, this all sounds very nice, but I just don't believe in God, or I just don't believe in the resurrection, or whatever. And I think those are important conversations to have with people, but I find that one way of responding, a different way, is by shifting the conversation to the question of trust. Whether we like it or not, we all place our trust somewhere. In our modern culture, we don't always call them gods or Jack, but I think that we all have our own set of gods competing for our trust. The various gods of economic growth, image production, sex, control, consumerism, financial power. Anyway, we could make a very long list of things. Everyone places their trust somewhere. Christians are people who place their trust in God, made known in Jesus Christ. When we are talking to people about Jesus, when we are showing people Jesus, I think this is one place to start. Whom do you trust? Christians are people who can trust God because of the love of God that was made known in Jesus Christ. So I'm going to pause here, and I just want to have an opportunity if anybody has any questions on what's been said so far, or if there's anything I can clarify. We'll have a chance for some conversation at the end, but if you do have any questions right now, you could ask them or you could just type them in the box right here, and I'll see if I can answer them so that we're all on the same page before we move on. And I'll also have a drink of water while we do.
So as Jesse said, I see a few folks are on the phone, but if you have so if you're on the phone, you can say aloud your question, or if you have a clarification question, feel free to type it into the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen, and we'll just pause and then we'll move on.
And while we wait, I'll just, I'm assuming since nobody said anything that everybody can hear me all right. But if not, should probably fix that as well. So Joe has asked a question about what is the equivalent of burning sacred shrines when we talk about rejecting the deities of our modern culture? Well, I think that's an excellent question. And I think that's definitely one that we want to talk about. I think one of the strengths of the Anglican tradition is that we do have this liturgical heritage. And it is interesting to me in thinking about the rejection of deities or jok and the burning of sacred shrines, how it was a quasi-liturgical act. I don't know if many Dinka Anglicans would describe it this way, but when I hear descriptions of it, that's what I hear. Perhaps I'm just, wired to hear things that way. But how people would gather and they would walk to places and they would burn the shrine together. They would chop the tree to show it didn't have any power anymore. And I wonder sometimes, are there liturgical resources available to us? Are there rites and rituals that we have in terms of rejecting other gods? So, well, we'd have to have a longer conversation about that, and perhaps we can continue it. But I think that's an excellent conversation to have and to think about what the church brings to that conversation in particular. Are there other questions, or should we keep moving? Great. I don't see anybody typing. And if you're on the phone and you want to ask a question, now's your chance. Great. Well, we'll carry on. As I said, there'll be more time coming up in just a moment. Well, in a little while. So we've talked about this question of what the goal of evangelism is. The second thing I want to talk about is how we evangelize. And to think about this question, I want to think about one of the main ways in which the Christian message was transmitted among the Dinka. Dinka culture has never had very much material culture. That is, Dinka never produced much stuff that you could touch or hold. There was no sculpture. There was no, there were a few musical instruments like drums and various things. I'm sorry, I just see a question from Marguerite. Marguerite, I'm just actually coming to that question, so stay tuned. So Dinka culture didn't have a lot of material culture. And even those shrines that I showed you to the Jack had to be repaired and replaced. But what Dinka did have was a strong culture that centered on music and songwriting. So music was sung for religious purposes, such as during a sacrifice, but it was also, music was also a part of social life and many other points of life as well. So for instance, young men in a cattle camp might sit around in the evening and write songs about their favorite bull, or the woman they had their eye on, or a wrestling match that they had won that day. None of these songs were written down, but good songs would be recognized. Good songs would be recognized, and they would gradually spread because people would teach them to other people. If your song was good, people would learn it and teach it to other people, and if your song wasn't good, it would just kind of be forgotten. One of the most remarkable things about the movement of religious change among the Dinka was that it was accompanied by an outpouring of song. Here's another picture from Kakuma refugee camp. You can see just sort of the full-bodied nature of the singing. Many, many Dinka were involved in writing Christian songs to express their new faith. In the 1990s, the Anglican Church among the Dinka set about creating a new hymnal to publish some of these songs so that they could be shared across the whole church. In that hymnal, you won't be able to see it, but I'm holding it right here, there's about 600 new compositions, but the committee that put the hymnal together had at least twice as many to choose from, and almost all of those compositions were composed in the midst of the war. And the songwriting continues today. There's plans to publish a new supplement to this hymnal shortly, hopefully within the next year or two. The hymn texts themselves are really fascinating, and you can make a very close study of what they say and what they demonstrate about Dinka theology. I'll just show you two texts very briefly. This is one of hymn number 4, one of the most famous in the hymnal. Let us give thanks to the Lord in the day of devastation and in the day of contentment. Jesus has bound the world round with the pure light of the word of his Father. When we beseech the Lord and unite our hearts and have hope, and the jock has no power, God has not forgotten us. Evil is departing and holiness is advancing. These are the things that shake the earth. And then you can see the chorus. So you can see some of the ways in which the jock are being rejected in the theology of these hymns, and people are turning to God. And just that line about being able to give thanks to God in the day of devastation, which Dinka certainly experienced during the war, and in the day of contentment as well, I think is a very profound thought about the nature of our relationship and what gratitude means in response to God. Second song is much shorter. It's just a chorus, but you can see again how it combines Christian themes with a rejection of the previous religion. The evil jock has been thrown down, and now the earth is filled with evil. I will take the blood of Christ, for I want to bathe. Who are those who have come out of deep anguish? I will take the blood of Christ, for I want to bathe. Nyalech is the supreme high God, has called us to attend a great meeting. So Nyalech, as revealed in Jesus Christ, is the Christian God. We are late. Nyalech, make us strong. So we could talk a lot about Dinka theology as revealed in the hymnal. We're going to press on, however, because I want to highlight two aspects of hymn writing for our discussion. The first is who was writing these hymns. One of the most remarkable aspects of the songwriting is the outsized role that so many women played. In the non-Christian religion, the religion of the Jack, women would often sing songs, but they were not composers of songs. In Christianity, however, women were among some of the most significant composers. And if you look at the index in the hymnal, you can see just how large a role women played. Many women literally found their voice, their songwriting voice, through Christianity. So to think about evangelism, one lesson I take away from all this is that sometimes it's the communications of socially marginal people that have the most success in speaking to new converts. Sometimes Christian communication involves making room for the voices of those who are experiencing the faith for the first time. And the second thing about hymns is the way in which they're transmitted. Remember I said earlier that songs were transmitted orally. Good songs would be passed around. Not so good ones would sink to the bottom and be forgotten. Roughly the same thing happened with hymns. In refugee camps and among displaced people, Dinka Christians would sit around and learn each other's songs. If it was a good song, people would remember it and want to learn it and teach it to other people. If it was a not so good song, if the theology wasn't quite right, or if it didn't speak to someone about their faith, it would gradually be forgotten. So here's a picture of a lot of women sitting around. You can't see in the picture, but there's somebody sort of teaching them a song, and they're all learning it together. This is the primary way in which the Christian message spread. I was talking earlier about worship, and one of the things I said was that singing hymns and then preaching them, singing hymns was the first thing, and then people would preach about them. The major form of Christian catechesis during the war was teaching hymns to one another. And what's interesting is how the form of cultural communication remains the same. The idea of sitting around and learning songs was something that both non-Christian and Christian Dinka did. What had changed, though, was the content. Instead of writing about a jock or writing about a cow, songs were now being written about Jesus Christ. When you keep the form of communication, a form of communication that is recognizable in one culture, it makes evangelism a lot easier. The Christian message was being shared in a form that was familiar to so many people. And I often think about this when I think about Christian communication in the 21st century. What is the form of our communication these days? How does that compare to the dominant forms of communication in our culture? As songs are to the Dinka, what is the equivalent for us? And I have to say, I don't have a lot of good answers on this one. And it's a question I ask a lot of people. I'd definitely be interested in your feedback. One thing we might think about as well is what is not a culturally appropriate form of communication. I really like and really value Christian worship, and I believe in it very strongly, and I believe in drawing more people into it. But sometimes when I'm in church on Sunday, I ask myself, is this a recognizable form of cultural communication in this day and age? Is standing in front of a group of people and talking to them a recognizable form? What would be a recognizable form? And I think all of these are questions that the experience of the Dinka poses for us. So we've talked about these questions of belief and trust to begin with as a way of thinking about the question, what is the goal of evangelism? And we've looked at the songs and music among the Dinka as a way of answering the question of how we evangelize. The final thing I want to talk about is the role of the Bible in all of this evangelism, and particularly the role of the stories in the Bible in shaping how we understand ourselves as people of God. Now, there's a lot we could say about how the Dinka used the Bible in coming to understand themselves as Christian, but what I want to highlight is this. The Dinka came to see their own story told in the stories of the Bible. They were part of the story of God's dealing with God's people. And there's several examples of this. We'll see what we can highlight here. The first is to think about chapter 18 of the prophet Isaiah, or in the U.S., Isaiah. Chapter 18 is a prophecy against the people of Cush. Cush is a word that's used in the Old Testament to refer to the ancient kingdom of Nubia, which was what it was in what is now northern Sudan. And I'll just bring up chapter 18 here. So a lot of text. I had to make it kind of small font, I'm afraid. But some parts of this chapter seem to refer to southern Sudan. So there's references in verse 2 to a nation tall and smooth. If you've ever met Dinka, you'll know that they're quite tall. If you look a little bit later on in verse 2, whose land the rivers divide. Well, the Nile River flows right through Dinka territory. In fact, many Anglican missionaries during the mission period looked at this chapter and thought that it referred to Sudan as well, and they would say, see, Sudan is in the Bible, so there it is. But Dinka took this identification with the biblical narrative to the next level, as it were, and in part, they did this because of a particular translation of the Bible, the Good News Bible, which is a translation into English, but for people who don't speak English as a first language. So we have the text here from the Good News translation. You'll notice a couple things about this. For one thing, the translators have added a heading to the passage, God will punish Sudan. That's not in the Bible, not in the Hebrew text at all. And then if you look down in verse 5 and 6, you'll see some references to the enemy will destroy the Sudanese as easily as a knife cuts branches from a vine. The corpses of their soldiers will be left exposed to the birds and wild animals. This is not in the Hebrew text, and it's not in the NRSV, but it is part of this paraphrase in the Good News Bible. So Dinka would read this chapter and say, this is our story, this is us, it's happening right here. And it's the last verse of chapter 18, verse 7, which is about how the Sudanese need to bring gifts to Mount Zion. So you can see verse 7, a time is coming when the Lord Almighty will receive offerings from this land divided by rivers, so on and so forth. They will come to Mount Zion where the Lord Almighty is worshipped. So Dinka could read this and say, this is the answer to the problem of the war. The war is a punishment from God for the worship of the Jack. And if Dinka turned to God, which is what this passage is indicating, by bringing God gifts, then things would change. It was all there right in the Bible. It didn't matter if this prediction had been made 2,500 years ago or yesterday. Here it was, the Dinka story told in the Bible, the holy book of the church. If the Dinka appeared in this book, then surely that was something they needed to pay attention to. This is not the only situation in which Dinka saw themselves in the Bible. The book of Lamentations was important. Various verses in Psalms were important as well. I have a picture here. This is a church service among a Dinka refugee camp in Kenya. This is a picture of a nativity play. It took me a while to figure this out, and it wasn't until I showed it to some Dinka that they could help me out. This is a nativity play in a Dinka church in this refugee camp, and these soldiers are representing the massacre of the innocents, the time when Herod sent out his soldiers to kill all the children around where Jesus was born to prevent a usurper to the throne. But you look at that and you can see how, I mean, the soldiers are represented with guns and dressed in a way that many Dinka would be familiar with from the war. They could read this story of the massacre of the innocents and they could say, look, it happened then, it's happening now in the same way. There were lots of other associations, some of them a little bit more positive or hopeful, at least from my perspective. As the church grew as a result of evangelism, there was a widespread belief among many Dinka that God was performing miracles. Many of these in particular had to do with healing. I said earlier that healing prayers were a part of every service, and it was often believed that clergy could heal people by their prayers. There are many stories of women who were not able to conceive, who were then prayed over and were able to conceive a child. In other cases, it was believed that God miraculously protected Christian communities at times of violence when the violence of the war affected non-Christians severely. And one of the most appealing things about the church during the war was the kind of community it showed to other Dinka. We want to be careful not to idealize this, but it does seem that church members did a pretty good job of showing forth a different kind of community to those around them. They shared the limited resources they had, they cared for one another, and they related to one another in a way that was unusual by Dinka standards. Now these aspects of Dinka life, the healing and the miracles, the community life, seemed, at least in some ways, to be a mirror image of what was described in the book of Acts at the end of chapter 2, just after the description of Pentecost. I won't read this all, but if you look at verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Verse 43, awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. Skipping ahead to verse 46, day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home, ate their food with glad and generous hearts. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Dinka could read this passage and say, basically, what's happening to us is right there in the Bible. If it's happening to the early Christians and it's happening to us, it must mean we're on the right track. And this became a powerful tool for evangelism. New Dinka converts could be told that not only would God be with them in the future, God had been with them in the past, as told in the Bible. And once you begin to see God not only in your future, but also in your past, then the momentum towards conversion becomes hard to stop. Conversion is not a sharp rupture, but merely a natural step to take based on a new recognition of all of this information. So what all of these examples show is the role the Bible played and the biblical narrative played in Dinka and among Dinka as Dinka evangelized. The Bible is basically a narrative that tells us about how God works. Christians are people who see themselves in terms of that story, who are inheritors of that story. One thing we might say about the goal of evangelism, to go back to that question, is that we want to bring people to understand themselves in terms of the Bible's narrative. Now, sometimes, I think especially for us in our part of the world, the Bible can seem pretty distant from the way we live right now. But I think that's a challenge for us as Christians, because the narrative of the Bible is so rich. You can spend a whole life reading the Bible and keep learning new ways in which it speaks to you. So we might choose to emphasize different parts of the narrative of the Bible in our part of the world than the Dinka did. But I think the basic idea about gathering around the Bible and seeing how God is speaking to us and how we see ourselves in its story is a pretty powerful idea and one that's a pretty basic function of evangelism. So that's 3 different areas that I wanted to cover in this presentation. And I think what I want to stress is that evangelism, showing other people Jesus, is a core part of our mission as Christians. In fact, I think Christians are people who show people Jesus. This happened in a really profound way during Sudan's civil war among the Dinka. And I've called this webinar Faithful, Trusting Christians, because I think that's the lesson that I take away from the experience of the Dinka. Being a Dinka is about putting our trust in God as God is made known in the love of Jesus Christ. That's what it means for Christians to be faithful people. And I think in a number of different ways, the evangelism of the Dinka shows forth the truth of this aspect of the good news of Jesus Christ. So I've just left up here some sort of 3 bullet points that distill some of the things I've been trying to talk about, questions that you can take home with you, questions we can talk about now. But I would be happy to, at this point, take any questions and perhaps have a conversation about some of the things that I've been saying.
Great. Thank you. And just to reiterate instructions for how to ask questions, for those who are signed on with their phone, you can just speak and ask a question that way. Otherwise, I think for the majority of folks, you'll probably need to type into the chat box in the left-hand side of the screen your question. And then one one additional note, which is a question we oftentimes receive, is I'm noticing some folks are just signing on, is we are recording this presentation, and we'll be able to make it available to folks who are just signing on as well, and then we'll have also the slides available at a later point. We invite your questions.
Betsy, can you say some more? This is Kevin Caruso speaking.
Hey, Kevin.
Can you hear me on the phone?
Yeah, you bet.
Hey, it's good to see you. Really enjoyed what you had to say.
Thank you.
Can you say something about sacramental practice sort of work? So they gather initially at these, opportunities to be together and worship, and how do they understand baptism and Eucharist? I know that's a part of our own conversation in the United States these days, and I wonder if there's anything we can learn from their experience around those things.
Yeah, so baptism was a huge debate. There was a massive debate among church leaders and among lay people about what kind of preparation was necessary before baptism. Also, all the questions that are usually encountered in African contexts about polygamy, and how do you baptize someone who's the second or third wife, or a man who has more than one wife. All of these questions were engaged in kind of, frankly, debates that are as sometimes fraught and complex as similar debates are in this country, in the United States or anywhere else. At least for the Dinka, were in a position where lots of people were clamoring to join the church, and they came from a history where there was lots of, it was usually required to do lots of baptismal preparation. That's what the missionaries had left behind. But gradually, with so many people clamoring to join the church, they just were like, we can't do all this preparation. We don't have enough time, enough people. So it was really a pragmatic decision, I think, to lower the requirements for baptism. As for Eucharist, there was really not a lot of Eucharistic practice among Christians during the war, in part because, well, for a number of reasons. One was the lack of ordained clergy, and another was just the lack of resources. Many people had come to understand that you had to have certain equipment. You had to have a chalice before you could celebrate communion, and people didn't have that. They also didn't have many prayer books to go around. So communion it didn't fall by the wayside, but it definitely became much less practiced. That being said, there's lots of great stories of bishops who would celebrate communion with like a little cup, and they would make some tea, and they would put a grape in it, and that would be their wine. So yeah, I haven't thought through all of the implications and connections to our own situation, but I mean, the sacraments are central to the church, and they were central then to the Dinka as well, provoking just as much conversation and debate, sometimes though around different topics, than they do for us in our context.
Thank you.
I see a question over here from Joe. And Joe, I think you're responding to the question about hymns, or what I was talking about, and what's the cultural form of communication. And so Joe's question is, we have too many forms of communication. I think that's absolutely right. And how do you cut through sort of all the chatter and noise? Oftentimes when I've asked this question in the past about what's the form of communication in our culture, somebody will want to say something about like blog posts or tweets. And those do get shared a lot. I'm wondering, is there any form of communication that's left in our culture that can speak to our culture as a whole? The thing about social media and the thing about the internet in general is we just go search out those things that are sort of like us already. We don't always have a lot of engagement with different ideas, or we really have to seek it out. And also about the commitment that goes into it. I mean, the commitment of learning a song and passing it on to somebody is a lot more than clicking share on a blog post. So, yeah, I think you're right. This is a reality of what it means to be, faithful Christians in the 21st century in the West, in the U.S., in the U.K., how we do all that. But I think they're good things to begin to think about. here comes one from Wendy. So Wendy's question is about the relationship of how has grassroots Christianity helped or hindered the cause of peace in Sudan? Great question. Could do a whole presentation on it. So in about 30 seconds, I'd say that Christianity has done a lot. In the late 90s, I mentioned in the early 90s how there's lots of inter-ethnic violence between Dinka and Nuer. One of the keys to ending that inter-ethnic violence, at least for a period, was the creation of what was called the people-to-people peace process. And that was church leaders who brought together leaders of various ethnic groups, brought them together, and basically brought about reconciliation in a really profound way. There's some writing out there about that. I could possibly point it to you at another time. On the other hand, one result of the mission period is that church denominations in South Sudan tend to fall along ethnic lines. So broadly speaking, Dinka tend to be Anglican and Catholic. Nuer people tend to be Presbyterian and some Catholic as well. That's entirely because of how the British colonial officials set up the map. But it does mean it makes ecumenical cooperation hard, and it sometimes means that the church, speaking broadly as the church of all the denominations together, can sometimes have trouble working together because it's mirroring ethnic divisions in society. But that's a great question, something to talk about a lot, and especially I haven't talked at all about the ongoing violence in South Sudan right now, but in many ways, which is a mirror of some of that violence from the early 1990s.
And Jesse, I'm wondering if you could just type your email or contact information into the chat box.
Yeah, I should have put that on the slide somewhere.
So that if folks want to continue the conversation, they can be in touch with you.
Yeah. And then
aware that it's 5 o'clock, so yeah.
Yeah. So I've just put up this last slide, which is some material. There's obviously a wealth of material out there about Sudan. Not always a wealth of material about the church in Sudan. You'll have noticed from the pictures that I've used a lot of resources from Mark Nickel, who was an Episcopal missionary in Sudan in the 1980s and 90s. He passed away in 2000, but I'm very grateful to his sister, Marvis, who's given me access to a number of his photos. There's an excellent book, I have it right here, called Why Haven't You Left?, which is a collection of his letters from Sudan, available from Church Publishing. I just checked, it's on Amazon. This is a wonderful introduction to some of the stories of Dinka and Sudanese Christians more broadly. His dissertation is called Dinka Christianity, which is the next one. Unfortunately, that's very hard to find in the U.S., but there it is. And then I've listed my own books. My recent book, Backpacking Through the Anglican Communion, has several chapters about the church in Sudan, which might be interesting. And then I've put up an article I wrote for the magazine Christian Century, which just came out at the end of last year, which is all about, well, it's a little bit more about Dinka Christianity with a particular focus on songs, which I was talking about this evening.